This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is animal rights. I will be speaking with an expert on that, David Faber from Michigan State University, and the conversation will begin in a moment. David Faber is my guest. He is a law professor at Michigan State University, and he specializes in animal rights. We'll be talking about the history of the subject, its present state, and what will happen in the future. But before I begin on that topic, let me just ask you, David, for a little bit of background about yourself personally, how you got into animal rights, and a little bit of background then about animal rights itself.
All right, be happy to do so. My story goes back quite a few years. In the 70s, I decided to work on environmental issues as part of the Earth Day movement and everything else that was happening back in the late 60s and 70s. And I went to law school and got my degree at William & Mary Law School and decided to ultimately, after a couple of years of practice, become a professor. And when I did that, I had to start writing, and I wanted to write about environmental area, but water pollution, air pollution seemed to be taken up by others, and I focused on wildlife. And in the writing of that paper, it just came to me at some point that, well, but why don't wildlife have some rights too? And so I proposed some rights for wildlife back in 1979. That publication got me connected to other people in the United States who are also interested in animal issues. And so I was invited to the first conference on animal law at Brooklyn Law School in 1981. And at that place, I met a number of the people that are still dominant players in the today. We started the next year. We met in California and started the Animal Legal Defense Fund. So I became a board member of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and for the next 22 years after that, I focused on every possible animal issue. So that sort of got me. That was my boot up, and I was with the people in the United States that were thinking about rights for animals at that point in time. So it was the dark ages. There weren't too many of us, but maybe 16 people in the whole United States that were lawyers that were thinking about this at the time.
Let me just ask then about the idea of animal rights before I go into the history, going back however many centuries, but people who may have philosophized about it. There are a lot of people who will say, well, why are we worrying about the rights of a bird, a dog, a cat, a cheetah, a panda, a salmon, when so many human beings themselves around the world and even in the West don't have the full access to rights? It was only a couple of years ago that, for example, homosexuals in the United States got the right to marry. I look at that all as a false argument and a false dichotomy. Is that your approach to people who ask about that as well?
Yes, it's my life. I get to choose what I want to focus on. There seem to be lots of people willing to focus on the other things. I'm not saying they're not important, but this is where I thought I could bring the most of my energy and my efforts to actually move the ball forward.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned Earth Day and sort of conservation groups. A lot of people, when they think of animal rights, I guess, don't think of them in concert with, I guess, people would call a holistic view of the earth, this sort of Gaia view of everything being interconnected. Do you think that it's an important thing that animal rights be placed in the larger context of nature preservation? Do you work in concert with, say, groups like the Nature Conservancy or something?
I think that's very important, but you are right. Note that that doesn't seem to be a parallel for what people in the animal rights movement deal. So I came to the movement as an environmentalist. That was what I was first. And then I became somebody interested in animal rights. And I've always seen it as two issues sitting next to each other, but not really interacting very much because they really have a different worldview. The environmentalists want to talk about ecosystems and interactions and holistic use of animals, and they really don't give any focus to individual animals and what happens to their lives. On the other hand, animal rights people care a lot about individual animals, but have no context in which to put them in the fact that they are part of a larger ecosystem. Yeah. So we get these really big issues about deer hunting in parks. where deers are causing disaster from an ecological point of view. And every environmentalist would say, no, deer have got to be shot because they're destroying the environment. And the animal rights people say, no, you can't shoot deer. Yeah. So it is definitely a dichotomy. And part of my scholarship is to try to bring those two things together. In the last, I'd say 5 years, there's been a number of attempts, and one major book that's come out to try to interrelate the environmentalists and the animal rights people, but I don't think that's really happened yet.
Yeah, I know. I saw a documentary maybe a year or so ago. I think it was about Yellowstone Park, where they reintroduced the wolves, and I saw other national parks too, where the deer or the moose or whatever the large grazing animals were so overgrazed that the small biospheres that they were in, the microbiomes or whatever they would call them, it reduced shading, which meant that amphibians around the streams, for example, couldn't thrive without the amphibians thriving. Mosquito populations increased. And so there's this whole domino effect that no one ever thinks about.
Right.
And so wolves, for example, are a natural cog that would cull these animals and prevent the overgrazing that would then collapse the biome.
Exactly. You have to have a top predator in any ecosystem. But most people in the animal rights movement just don't think about top predators or ecosystems. It's just not part of their worldview.
Yeah. Let me just ask, since you work at Michigan State University, the Animal Legal and Historical Center, and I'll link to that website as well as your personal page underneath this video. Let me just talk about the historical idea of animal rights. Does this go back to classical time? Were there any Greek philosophers or Chinese philosophers thinking about the rights of a sparrow, say?
Not that I know of, no. Well, you have to differentiate legal rights from ethical obligations.
Okay.
Those are two different worlds. And clearly, there have been a number of people over the millennia that do think animals are important and that we ought to have some obligation towards them. But the idea of actually giving them rights in a courtroom is something that's really of a more modern nature.
Well, that brings up the idea of agency. Can someone have a right if they don't have even a concept of it? I mean, yes, you could say that a mentally retarded human being would have human rights, quote unquote. But if we're talking about animals, we run the gamut from the great apes and the whales and elephants and a handful of some birds that have what we would consider high intelligence, if not human level. And then we get down to things like, a walking stick, insects,
Right.
squids, and although squids also are quite intelligent, but what we would consider dumber animals, things that are just sort of automata, organic automata. Do you think that there is a spectrum of rights, say that a chimp has more rights than, say, I have 4 cats than my cats, and my cats have more rights than, say, a water bug?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I think rights have to match what are the interest and needs of the particular animal. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a snake or a frog, their interest and needs are frankly kind of limited.
Yeah.
But if you have a chimpanzee, their interest and needs are much more complex, much more like us. Yeah. So they're going to have more complex rights to match that.
Do you think that on, let's just say, a base public relations level, that it's important to get human beings, individuals, to understand that animal rights are important because it also benefits humanity? Because I think people need to have that. I've often thought that human beings, our simian nature, we're basically selfish. And in order for us to think beyond ourselves, even in human social groups, we have to have a stake in something. So what is the stake that human beings have in animal rights?
Well, I guess there are several. At the first level, it's because it's the right thing to do. If you have an ethical view of the world and you see these other complex beings out there, and you have to decide, do they not deserve some consideration for their lives, just like we have consideration of our lives, and that consideration be recognized within the legal system? Because our society, if you don't have something recognized in the legal system, then in all likelihood, many animals, it doesn't really exist. Even though there may be 1 million people who think animals should have some some protections and interests. If they can't get it into the law, it's not going to.
Yeah. Let me ask about animal rights and again going back to history. What are some of the major religions' views on animal rights, and if they generally been a hindrance or a help to the legal efforts to secure rights? I.e., is mainline Judaism or mainline, say, Roman Catholicism, do they have, does the Pope believe, I think I remember, it might have been Pope Francis when he was recently installed a couple of years ago, had said that animals had souls and stuff. Has that helped the movement?
Yes, that did actually, I think, help the movement. It gave cover for those of that religion to actually become more forthright about their consideration of animals. Mm-hmm. But I must say, historically, religions have really been sort of neutral on the issue of whether or not animals should have legal rights. They are human-focused enterprises, quite clearly. And I can't speak for the Eastern religions. I don't know them well enough. But the Christianity, in all of its diverse pieces, that don't, except for the Good Shepherd idea, i.e. the duty to take care of the animals, religion don't go too far beyond that.
Well, let me ask about the legal consequences or the birth of the legal push for animal rights. Did it start in the U.S. or was it started in Europe or elsewhere? And was there a first case that was sort of like, when we think of the slavery movement, the anti-slavery movement, there are 3 or 4 major things: Plessy versus Ferguson, up through Brown versus the Board of Education. When did the legal push for animal rights begin? And what are some of the landmark cases and what did they establish?
Well, I think we're too early in the history to say that. We haven't established animal rights yet. So you're acting as if we already have rights for animals, and we do not. I think the landmark cases are what is being done right now in New York by Steve Wise and his cases about habeas corpus for the chimpanzees that are there. I think in 10 or 20 years, those will be seen as the first significant attempt to establish legal rights for animals.
But we have for decades had animal cruelty laws in a lot of places, correct? Wouldn't they be the beginnings?
Yes. But those aren't, well, that depends on what you mean by animal rights then. And this is one of the problems with this phrase, is that if I say animal rights to 15 people, I'm going to get at least 14 different opinions about what that phrase actually means. And so I don't use animal rights as a phrase very often because I don't know what I'm telling my audience and what they think that means. And if you mean animal welfare is reflected with the anti-cruelty laws, i.e. we have laws in place to take care, in theory, of the physical well-being of animals in our society. Except for the fact, of course, that farm animals and scientific research animals are totally exempted from those laws. Game animals are totally exempted from those laws. So they end up pretty much applying only to domestic pets. So it's a limited world there.
Well, let me ask what the mission then.
If animal rights.
Well, let me just ask what the mission.
If you want to talk about animal welfare, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But let me just ask about then what your Animal Legal and Historical Center, what your mission is. Do you have, a 3 or a 5-point plan, over the course of the next decade or two that you need to establish? For example, just looking at gay rights, I think that's the gay marriage in the U.S. When I think the first petitions were filed back in like maybe 2005, I figured it was going to take 25 years knowing how the legal system works. But I was surprised that within 10 years, they accomplished much more quickly, and I think they did so by putting a human face or appealing to human beings' consciences rather than their pocketbooks. Is there a same sort of game plan that people in the legal side, at least of animal rights, are looking to follow to secure that for animals?
Well, you hit upon one of the primary problems that we do have in the animal rights movement. That is, the animals can't speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So no press person can go interview the chimpanzee to talk about how horrible the conditions are in their life. So we're stuck with having to have humans that speak for the animals, and obviously try our best. But clearly, all the human rights movement have been moved forward by the people directly impacted by that movement being able to speak. and speak to the broader community. And we can't have the animals speak except through video and photography of them doing what where they're captured. And clearly, some photography is very effective, but it's not the same thing as being on TV.
So again, let me just get back on what are the main goals of your particular organization?
Well, the library that you're talking about, my website, is simply a library. That's not a program in itself. My goal was to allow access to the law for everybody who's interested in learning about animal law. And so we have 8,000 people a day that come to my website to learn about and get the actual wordage of various laws around. So that's just a major resource tool for everybody. But the goals that I would think we might have are, well, there's two approaches to this. Steve Wise, in his New York suit, is trying to get animal rights established by the courts in a very bright and sort of explosive way. In other words, he's confronted the courts and said, okay, a chimpanzee is a person. You tell me why they're not a person, and I've got every primatologist in the world submitting briefs showing that they have the same characteristics, both physically and mentally, as human beings do, as a 5-year-old human being. So, therefore, that you should give us our rights. So that's one approach. That's head-on confrontation. The other thing that I also support, though, is the incremental development of animal rights. And that is, what I think is important, is that we get the interest of animals recognized within the legal system. The big thing that most people think about when they think about animal rights is, can the animal be a plaintiff? Can the animal sue? That's what Steve Wise is trying to establish. Can the animal sue? And I'm not thinking that, well, they don't have to sue to have their interest in the court and be recognized. And we have two primary examples of that right now. One, just 2 months ago, Alaska, a divorce law that came into effect that changed the law in Alaska, and such that now pet is part of a divorce. Judge has the ability to look at the animal and say, what's in the best interest of that animal? As opposed to what the law now says is, who bought the animal? Who owns the animal? That's who gets the animal. So now the animal itself has a personality, a presence before the judge, and the judge has to look at it as an individual, not as a piece of property, and say, what are we going to do with this animal? What's in its best interest? Not unlike what you would do for a child. So that I think, is animal rights. Another example of what animal rights is we've, over the past 20 years, almost every jurisdiction has changed their trust laws such that you can now have a trust, and if you have $100,000 that you got, you can go to a trust for your animal. We allow animals to be beneficiaries of appropriately established trust, and they will be enforced as if it was children. So again, that's giving the animal visibility and personality within the legal system. And I think that's a slower, incremental approach, but I think it's winning.
Well, let me ask about some of the other groups out there. There are groups like Friends of Animals and PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And some of them, like PETA, have sort of a checkered history in terms of public relations. A lot of people look at them as having done some outrageous things, supporting sometimes things that seem antithetical to the movement. Do you think that a legalistic approach is a better approach, or do you think that some of these groups serve the cause well or sometimes hinder it?
It's a mixed package, clearly. Because what I can't do as a lawyer is move social attitude. And if you don't move the social attitude to be more aware of and supportive of animal interests, then you're not going to get the judges, the legislators, to change their mind. So, I think there are a lot of groups doing a lot of very positive things. Every now and then, groups do things that I think are counterproductive, but what can I say? They're doing what they think they need to do.
Well, I asked earlier about the effect of religion upon the quest for animal rights. Let me ask about science. Going back a few decades to the middle of the 20th century, we had studies with like Coco the gorilla. We've had similar studies, like I said, on some aves, like the birds, crows, parrots have been shown to have extremely high intelligence. We have done research on whales, dolphins, porpoises. The smaller whales seem to be even smarter than the larger whales. We have learned more about the social structures of chimps and bonobos, even to the fact that some of them seem to have their own patois different from others. Do you think that the weight of science will, if not yet, will just make it inevitable that animal rights will be accepted worldwide? And do you think America is lagging behind?
Well, those are two very different questions. I think science is playing a critical role here, absolutely, because the more we keep being surprised that animals are smarter than we thought they were, they're more able than we thought they were, and I think we're beginning to understand that they have capabilities that we don't have, quite frankly. But it's not a matter of logic. This is not going to happen just because of logic. We have the issue that there are millions of people who are not sure they believe in evolution.
Yeah. And
if you don't understand that we share this earth with other animals, that we are an animal, then you're not as open to the science involved. You still think you're superior to all animals. And that's a problem that religion has put upon us, is created a bit of a barrier in accepting the idea that animals should be other players on the stage.
And how about America versus the rest of the world? Japan, for example, has famously flouted anti-whaling laws.
Yeah, no, the United States is, I think, by far the most progressive in the area of animal rights. We have a rights history here, and it's now discussed quite a bit in Europe. That's quite clear, and there's some efforts over there, but they don't have anywhere near the number of people or the organizations or the money behind what's happening here in the United States. We are clearly on the forefront of that, just like we are with many of the human rights.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that many human beings, in order to get on board something, either have to have a stake or feel they have a stake in the outcome, or, such as in gay rights, an appeal to just basic human decency. Now, a lot of people I know that when they hear a term like animal rights, they're going to say, what, I can't have burgers anymore? Are you kidding me? Can someone be, for example, a carnivore or an omnivore and also support animal rights, or must one be a strict vegetarian or vegan?
Well, that's going to depend on who you ask. Obviously, many people in the animal rights movement have that belief that you need to be a vegan. I do not have that belief myself. I think you can, but I don't think I support, well, I know I don't support the eating of animals that come out of our industrial process at the moment because of the extraordinary cruelty that's inflicted upon those animals. But those aren't the only agricultural animals out there. There are others available that have a very good life. And then that's another decision you have to make about whether or not you're going to eat them or not. But yeah, I think part of what you haven't touched upon this, but I think this is a key problem. That is that meat movement want animals to not be property. They make a parallel to human slavery and say until they are freed from the property status, that then they are not free. And I teach property law, so I know a little bit about property. And I reject that position, and I say that, no, animals can have rights and still be property. I don't know why they think that has to be a psychological keystone to so many people that freeing the animals means eliminating the property status, which they never seem to follow that logic to its end, which means you don't have any domestic animals at all. Because if we don't have the legal system a giving responsibility to who's going to take care of these animals, I don't know how you can have any. So all the dogs and cats would have to go away to fit the pure view of animal rights that exists in a lot of the revolution.
Yeah. Another aspect that people seem to turn off to about animal rights is that they'll say, well, we're trying to cure humans of cancer or AIDS or this or that, whatever thing, the next plague that comes raging out. And we need animals to do medical experiments on. Even to a lesser extent, we need animals to make sure that the sugars we put in our bodies, or the makeup that we put on our cells, or the colognes or whatnot, don't, kill someone. What is your stance personally on animal experimentation, and also what is the overall stance of the animal rights movement, or maybe I should say animal rights movements, because there's certainly a plurality there?
Well, I think that may be one of the most difficult topics to address. First of all, you talked about two different things, and you should recognize that testing is not the same as science. So when you talk about cosmetics, that's not any science whatsoever involved there. And I think, from what I understand about alternatives being developed in the world of science for the testing of new chemicals, we are pretty much at the point where that should be just thrown away, because we now, with the new science and the new computer capacities to take information and do things with it, I don't think we're going to need to be testing on animals anymore for products. Now, actual science, I don't think, again, you see, there's a false dichotomy that you either give all animals all rights at once, or no animals no rights at once, and that's simply not the way it is. Animals are going to get rights species by species, location by location, law by law. There's not going to be a whole new genre that's all of a sudden imposed on people that eliminates all human use of animals. I do not see that in the cards. Although a number of people in the animal seem to have that as a goal, but it's not real. It's not real. So we take chimpanzees in science, for example. 20 or 30 years ago, they were clearly appropriate subjects of science, right? And now they're not. The world of science has decided, not Congress, not anybody else. If you look at what happened within the world of science, they report to each other, and they ultimately decided, you know what, we shouldn't use chimpanzees anymore. In fact, let's get them out of the lab and send them to islands where they can have sanctuary. So the world does change. It takes time. It's attitude, and that's what the science is sort of self-educating itself. And I think, although they don't make strong ethical statements, read between the lines, the science is saying we can't do this anymore. It's just not right. Doesn't make any sense to impose these conditions on chimpanzees for what little information we get. Also, if you look into the debates, you'll find that it seems like a whole lot of science that uses animals is misusing animals. It's been an easy thing to do, to experiment on animals, and we don't have a way to sort that as to what's good science and bad science. We need to keep the pressure on the scientists to use animals only where it's absolutely necessary. And I think in time we will with our computer capacities that are building the way they are, we're going to keep moving further and further away from the need for those animals.
Yeah. Let me just ask you legally, because I remember a couple of years ago, and I was just looking up that a couple of years ago in 2015, there were lawsuits filed in New York State for, on behalf of the personhood of several chimpanzees, and I think that they lost their petition. But I was just reading that the people who filed did consider it somewhat of a victory. Can you just maybe just in a couple of minutes try to distill that case down? What were they seeking, and what import would have it had towards the animal rights movement?
Well, first of all, that case is not over. Oh. A higher court heard a full argument on the appeal of that case just 2 days ago in New York. Oh. So this is a Steve Wise non-human rights project. And yes, he filed a suit 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And it was for 4 chimpanzees that existed within New York. He filed suits in 3 different locations. And he brought a suit of habeas corpus, which is an old common law cause of action available to beings that says that if you're being held inappropriately, i.e. if the state has you in jail but has no reason for you to be there, you bring an action of habeas corpus to get freedom. Historically, it's also been made available for example, if somebody swept up children along the street and then put them in a warehouse to make them work, child labor sort of thing, you could bring an action of habeas corpus to get them freed from those conditions. So he's bringing an action to free them from their confinement. 2 of them were in scientific research facilities in small cages, and the other two were held by individuals in small concrete cages and had no companionship and were totally, I think, inappropriate. The people that held them meant well, but they weren't really having a very good life. And so he wanted this habeas corpus. And he chose habeas corpus because in New York, the statute says any person may bring an action for habeas corpus. And the word person, this is a real disconnect between lawyers and non-lawyers. The word person simply means those entities that are able to bring a lawsuit. To the average person, the word person means human being, but it doesn't mean that in the law. And so what Steve Wiseman was saying, okay, I have these four beings, chimpanzees here, and I think they should be considered persons by the court. At the lower level, he didn't really expect to win there because that's not what lower court judges do. This is an issue that would have to go to the Supreme Court of the state. And he knew that. Yeah. And he's just not there now. One of the judges below wrote a very nice opinion saying, I agree this is a serious topic, and I hope the courts above will take this into account, but I'm not in a position to change the law.
Yeah.
So he did lose at the lower level, but it was a nice setup for the appeal process.
Yeah, and I wanted to just get into the idea of personhood. Oftentimes, with legal precedents, you get rights of one group sort of piggybacking on the rights of others. For example, I mentioned homosexual marriage being confirmed just a couple of years ago by the U.S. Supreme Court, and I would think that if I was, for example, a polygamist, this would be a goldmine, because how can you deny polygamy if you're giving homosexuals same-sex marriage rights? In the same vein, I've always wanted, and I did a show, for example, on corporate personhood, which is corporations are fictional entities, and it was almost 200 years ago that I think the U.S. Supreme Court established corporations as de facto persons with their own interests, aside from the people who comprise them. So it always has struck me as bizarre that we can create fictional entities known as corporations that are granted personhoods, but animals don't have it. And just looking a little bit into the future, a few decades, if artificial intelligence comes online, we're going to have to be deciding personhood for artificial entities. So do you think, for example, that the battle for artificial intelligence augurs well for animal rights?
No. I don't want to go there.
Okay.
I don't find that helpful at all.
Okay.
I would suggest that artificial intelligence is at least as intelligent as we are, and I don't think I buy that.
Okay.
Also, I would like to contest your position that corporations are persons in the sense we're talking about here. Because, yes, you're right, obviously, the law considers a corporation a person. But I don't think a corporation is separate from the human beings that make it up. I mean, what does a corporation represent? It represents the shareholders' interest in making money.
Yeah.
It is not independent of human beings. They represent a specific interest of a human being. All the other things, towns, cities, ships, all the other things that are brought up are all human-focused activity. And what the law has done is allow people to segregate out a particular interest of their own and have that represented in a group setting by the designation of a town or a corporation, for example. But those are all human interests. The city has no interest beyond human beings.
Yeah. Let me talk. Go ahead.
Saying about animals is a different barrier. It's not an easy barrier. I don't think the fact we have corporations really helps us get personhood for animals.
Okay. Well, let me. I had mentioned before about sort of Gaia theory and a broader view of animal rights, including, as you had said, nature and whatnot. Let me ask about what global warming, because it seems with global warming, and we hear things about extinction events, and we have had for decades now endangered species lists, and most recently some scientists have thought that maybe we have moved into a new era on Earth called the Anthropocene, that human beings have so impacted the Earth. Do you think that things like the endangered species lists have helped raise in the public consciousness the idea that that animals, are significant? It's not just man against nature, but there are these other beings out there that are affected as well. And I mean, what is your take on that whole the thing that because a lot of people get pissed off, oh, I'm not going to have my lumber job because of the red-billed cuckoo pepper, or that is going to be out there.
Right. Well, I think the environmentalists have moved significantly forward, and clearly the Endangered Species Act represents probably the high watermark of taking into account complexities of ecosystems and protection of animals. But of course, the Endangered Species Act is about keeping a system in place. It's not about the pain and suffering of individual animals or their capacity to self-realize what kind of animal they are and their nature. It's how many animals are alive, and can they continue to be alive? Do they have the habitat? That interferes with a lot of human beings, I have to agree, but appropriately, because we have to protect the ecosystems that they are part of. So the endangered species are the front end, the protective argument that allows us to address very significant environmental issues. But it doesn't seem to cross over to because a number of lawsuits were brought in the names of endangered species, not particular animals, but like in the names of bird species, there's a squirrel, there's a red squirrel case, and other ones. The federal court specifically held ultimately that no, the parties are human beings that are being brought under the Endangered Species Act, but the animals are not the parties to the action.
Yeah.
And that's what could change, is what if the whales could bring an action on behalf of their species to do something about the global warming issues, for example. But at the moment, the law doesn't do that. One California federal court said it would be fine with them if Congress would amend the law to allow the actions to be brought by the animals themselves. But until Congress does so, we can't let that happen. So it's a possibility that could be a crossover.
Yeah. I guess the next logical step people would ask, if animals have rights, could they then sue for damages? For example, about a year or so ago in Cincinnati in a zoo, a young boy climbed over or under some fences and fell into a gorilla exhibit, I guess you would call it. And there was a large male gorilla who was well beloved. I forget his name now, but he was well beloved by the community and by the zoo. And he clearly was not overtly aggressive, but he was so strong that he could have killed the kid, and they eventually shot him. And it became, for about a month or so, a big cause celeb. And a lot of people, Harambe, I think was the gorilla's name, Justice for Harambe, just like we have, justice for this, that, or the other group of humans. Do you think that the next logical step, though, and this is, I think, something people fear, and companies and corporations, and fear that, well, if my child is playing outside and the neighbor's dog comes along and starts baring its teeth and and I get my gun out and shoot the dog, am I going to be sued for $1 million by the neighbor for murdering the dog? What are the things?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Because you have self-defense.
Yeah.
That's stupid to make that sort of argument. You always have self-defense. Even if dogs had full rights, you can shoot a human that's attacking your child. Of course, you can shoot the dog.
I know, but for example, in the case with Harambe, there was a sort of gray line. The gorilla, and so I guess a lot of people would argue that it brings up a lot of unnecessary things where if they don't have rights, it's very simple. A human being always outweighs an animal, and I guess when we put things on that balance, the tip of justice, would animal rights always mean? Or could you conceive, for example, of a legal situation where an animal's rights would outweigh the rights of a human being?
Well, they already do. In the Endangered Species Act, the animal rights as a group outweigh the human being all the time. Yeah. They're limited in what they tell humans they can't do that, right? So yes, absolutely. That is a consequence of giving another group rights, is that means they're in the mix and they can win.
Mm-hmm. Well,
now, what you hear are silly arguments about what kind of debates those might be.
Yeah.
The debate I want to talk about is the person that keeps the dog in the basement for its life, and it throws some bones down there. I want to be able to free that dog out of there. That's the right of the dog to a decent life.
Yeah. Let me just ask you then, what are some of the major criticisms of the animal rights movement, and do you think that any of them have, if not total merit, that would demolish the ideas of animal rights. What do you think? Is there any one outlook that has some merit, even though you think it's not enough? What if you can think of either legal or ethical or anything?
No, I think there's room for rights, and I don't know of any argument that's going to stop me from arguing for animal rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me talk then about the future. Where do you think on, say, a timeline, if you will, animal rights are? Are we still, say, at in the 18th century, where we own slaves? Are animals at the rights level of a slave? 250, 300 years ago here in America? Because even then, I think they was considered 3/5 of a human being or something like that, right?
Well, that was just for counting votes.
Okay.
No, I think the animals are ahead of the human slavery that we had in the United States. It was, if you go back and look at the laws around 1800 to 1850, in the slave states, those human beings that were slaves had no rights whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
They were not seen by the law. They were nothing but property. They were like a stool. They barely had. Well, let's just leave it with that. Whereas we now have the anti-cruelty laws, we have this new one for trust, we have this new one for divorce proceedings, and chimpanzees are no longer part of research. So I think we're on the upslope of getting rights for animals.
And how about public attitudes? And where do you think the public is? Is the animal rights movement sort of at the place where, say, in the 1820s or 30s, the abolitionist movement was? Is it at the place of, say, the suffragist movement, in the 1870s or 1880s?
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, I maybe the suffrage movement in the 1880s. I think that might be an appropriate point of. Because there were, I think, a lot of people who understood and agreed with the suffrage movement, but the political, social transformation hadn't yet happened to let that be. See, one of the things about rights is, for a new group to get rights, the old group has to acquiesce in the expanding of that circle of rights. And for the suffrage movement, men had to agree, yes, women should be able to vote. So the women could demonstrate all they want, but ultimately they have to convince the men to do that. And now we have the animals asking for not equal rights, but some legal rights. Yeah. And therefore, ultimately, we as folks have to be willing to say, yes, we're willing to give up some of our otherwise protected area because we think these beings deserve consideration in our legal system.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make, and I think it's one that's often missed, is that animal rights are not looking for 100% absolute parity with human beings. A sparrow, as I said, is not going to be equal to you or me and able to bring grievances about something. But let me ask, just say on a pragmatic level, if on a scale of 0 to 10, and 10 being the establishment of a whole plenum of rights along a spectrum for animals, where are we, and what 2 or 3 key fundaments have to be established to get to 10? And does it take 1, 2, 3, or can one thing just knock over the whole row of dominoes and get us to 10?
I don't think one thing can knock it all over. That is a difference. People keep hoping that exists out there, and it could happen if there was a constitutional amendment. But I don't see that as any realistic possibility. So I don't think it's a domino thing. I would say on the scale of 1 to 10 that we're at about 3, maybe 4. And that we're going to we clearly are getting more concern for animals and more focus on animals as we go through. And I think you might be interested to think about this for a minute. That is, what is enhancing the visibility of animals. And I think it is what's happened to our families. That more and more families, literally millions of families, now have companion animals as a significant psychological part of the core family. They are inside the family. And that's part of what I'm arguing in some of my stuff now, is that it is appropriate to talk about our dogs and cats as family members, as the one Alaska divorce law now suggests. And as that happens, then I think people are more open to the idea of, well, what about non-companion animals, the other animals? And shouldn't we give some consideration to them? And so that's, I think, the wedge that is fully transforming our society is the reduction in the size of family, the smallness of families, and the increase in the number of companion animals that are parts of families.
So do you think that by mid-century, perhaps, that we will have what would satisfy most people like you, a plenum of animal rights along a spectrum? Or do you think we're talking the end of this century or into the next century?
No, I think by 2050, I think there could be some significant change. Yes, I don't. But as you noted, things can change quickly and not foreseeably. So I don't see I can't see into the future. But I would guess that by 2050 we would have more significant rights for animals.
Okay, well, let me end this segment, and in our final segment, I'll ask about you and your organization's mission specifically, and we'll do that in a moment. Finishing up my conversation with legal scholar and animal rights expert David Faber, we talked a bit about the history of animal rights, its current state. Let me just ask you, as you look forward into the future yourself, what do you personally and your group hope to see in the next 5 or 10 years? And is there one or two major cases that you know of coming up here in America that are going to be, possibly groundbreaking?
Well, we'll deal with two different categories. One is law, statutory law, and the other is case law. In the case law area, Steve Wise's Non-Human Rights Project is continuing its appeals within New York, so that is yet to be resolved. But he's also going to bring cases about elephants, I'm pretty sure, in the next year or so, and some other cases in other states. So his organization is going to be pushing the envelope very clearly in the rights for animals area. And I'm not going to add to that personally. He's got that well in hand. But on the legislative side of things, like the Alaska law that was just adopted for animals in divorce, Hawaii has just put a bill on the table, and Connecticut has just put a bill on the table that might do the same thing. So I see the next decade having a ripple effect of states adopting laws that be better for animals in the divorce. Another thing I see happening in the next 5 years or so is North Carolina has a law that allows private parties to bring an action against another private party for enforcement of the cruelty law. And under civil, you obviously can't have one party put another person in jail or anything, but you can bring a civil action to make sure that the standards that we presently have that are now dependent upon prosecutors to bring actions might be brought by civil parties. And that would allow us to access, with our own energy and effort, a number of animal problems that are not being addressed at the point right now. So adoption of the New York law in other states, the North Carolina law in other states, I think would be on our agenda.
Two final brief questions, and you can take your time. Do you think it's going to be easier to establish rights for mammals and birds, things that we are more comfortable with? We like fuzzy, cute animals. We like things. Whereas establishing rights for an octopus or a spider or something is going to be more difficult?
Oh, absolutely. I had a very clear example of that. I used to attend the every 2-year conference of the International Treaty CITES for the Protection of Endangered Species. And the first time somebody proposed that we protect sharks, it went nowhere. Sharks had no public support whatsoever. It's taken like a decade before people could bring themselves to protect sharks. So yes, there is a cute and fuzzy component to it, and we in the animal movement are quite willing to utilize that and move animals forward with that. And the others will be sort of in the wake of that process, I think.
And my final question is, when we talk about animal rights and we've talked about endangered species, are we talking? Do you think that collective animal rights for a species or a genera of animals is going to be something separate than individual rights, i.e. the abused dog in the kennel in Chicago, his individual rights to not be abused is a different ballgame than the rights of whales off of Newfoundland?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I do think group rights are going to come to wildlife much sooner than individual rights might. Mm-hmm. And obviously for domestic animals, we're primarily talking about individual rights. But yes, I think group rights are quite possible in the future for wildlife.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for spending some time speaking about it. I will link to your website and your group's website below this video. Anyone interested in animal rights can contact you there. So David Faber, thank you very much.
You're welcome.